and they would work on protecting those areas, and they would let us know where those areas were so we could slow the cutting while they worked on getting, full protection for that area. So it was really an amazing coordination effort. We would blockade roads with what they call black bears. They were these metal sleeves that we would lock into and all sit in a circle. There were tripods where we would put up these 20-foot poles, 3 poles together, and then an activist would scale up and sit at the top. And we were blocking the logging trucks from being able to get in and do the work. We would sometimes not eat and drink very little for like 48 to 24 hours beforehand so that we did not have to use the bathroom, so we could just sit all day. Sometimes adult diapers.
Wow.
We were dedicated. And of course there was the tree sitting as well. And that was where we actually traversed the trees, went up, created platforms and hammocks, and lived in the trees that were destined to be cut. So I actually did a tree sit for 2 months. I was up for about 6-7 weeks, where there wasn't a platform, it was all a hammock, just a large rope hammock between 4 trees. And I didn't stand up for 6 weeks. It was just crawling in this hammock and moving, and it was a fascinating experience. But this whole time, the farmed animals were calling me. I was vegan, and there were other vegans. It was a small contingent actually back then that were vegans. I bet if it was now, they possibly all would be, but we were a small contingent. It was funny. They would call us cold feet because we refused to wear the wool socks that would protect your feet from getting so drenched in the damp forest, because we didn't want to wear wool. We'd only wear cotton. So we were always called the cold feeders. But anyway, this whole time the farmed animals were really calling me, and I felt this pull to start working for farmed animal issues. And there were not a lot of people doing that back then. We're talking about the early 90s here. There wasn't a whole lot. Animal rights activism was focused mostly on anti-vivisection and targeting science and scientific experimentation, anti-fur issues. And I did some of that. But the movement was starting to shift to see that just the sheer numbers of animals that are affected in animal agriculture was overwhelming. The suffering they endured was just awful, out of control. So I decided to take some of these tactics that were being used in the Earth First movement and bring them down to more urban areas. I migrated down to Sonoma County, California, which is about an hour north of San Francisco. A lot of farming there, big farming country. So I thought that would be the place to be, especially kind of humane farming, and we'll get into that. But I brought these tactics down with me, and we did the lockdowns. We used concrete filled barrels where it had the arm sleeve, the black bear, inside the barrel, so that you'd put these barrels side by side and you'd sit between the barrels and put your arms in, and we blockade slaughterhouses. There was 2 main slaughterhouses in Sonoma County, and there was a chicken processing plant in Guerneville and another in Petaluma. And we would actually blockade the slaughterhouses for the day. We would stop the slaughter for the day. We stopped production for the day. The problem was we didn't have the internet. Nobody fucking knew. Oh, pardon my French. Can I? Sorry. I don't know. Yeah, anyway, I'll try to not do that. But
it's okay. It's the passion.
So, nobody knew what we were doing. We weren't able to tell our own story because we didn't have the internet. You know, we were just hoping and praying that a reporter would maybe say something, and maybe say something favorable, which they never did. You
Mhm.
know, so it felt very futile. It felt really like, kind of frustrating doing that kind of action, where nobody knew. Nobody, you're out in the rural at the slaughterhouse. Nobody knew. So although I think that it was important, I think that it started getting people involved and people getting the message out. However, after 14 arrests, I decided to kind of shift more, and this is getting into the 2000s now, more into vegan education, tabling, leafleting, those kinds of things that a lot of us were doing, realizing that we needed to go directly to people, tell them what was happening, hand them a leaflet. And I think that, I mean, I don't regret at all doing the direct action we did. I think it was, really powerful and really important. But I envy the activists today for having the internet and being able to really tell your story in the streets. We didn't have that back then.
Mhm.
So I'll pause now and see if you want to go in a different direction, or if you want to hear more, or I don't know what.
Yeah, no, that's like it's super inspiring just because like yeah, you've been like vegan for like longer than probably loads of people even knew that it existed. So yeah, or like yeah, it's just yeah, it's quite amazing. And yeah, and also to just hear like kind of like all the techniques, some of that stuff like yeah, we try to use that in um like our own protests or actions and stuff like that. So it's also really nice to like hear like the legacy behind it. And yeah, so thank you. Just I wanted to also well touch up back come to your book. So The Ultimate Betrayal. um you talk about like a humane hoax in there. So would you be able to kind of explain the concept of what the humane hoax is and like what kind of inspired you to write your book? Yeah.
Yeah, so being in this for as long as I have, I started seeing a shift in the industry, in labeling, and really, I feel, and I'll take some credit for this, is that I think it was the work that we were doing, of course, reaching out and exposing the horrors of animal farming. So people were starting to ask questions, consumers were getting a little more concerned about things. And so there started being a shift in the market. You started seeing labels like cage free and free range and things like that. And this was about 2011 that I started doing the research. I thought, I'm going to look into this. I want to see what's going on with these labels, and if it's really better. And when I went into the research and went into writing the book, honestly, I thought that I was going to be saying things like, oh, well, free range is better, but going vegan's best. Or, grass fed's better, but going vegan is best. I honestly thought that. I was fooled. I was duped by the hoax as everyone else is. Looking deeply in, I realized that is not the case. And I never said that in the book because it's not the truth. The truth is that there are inherent cruelties in the industry that any producer, they can't circumvent and still create a profitable product. I mean, there are things that are the worst of the worst things, the things that the reasons we're vegan. The baby chicks that are killed in the hatcheries by the millions, the little baby males that are killed in the egg industry. That still happens for all the egg laying hens that are labeled cage free or free range, or anything, any of these labels. They still, the farm, they can't profitably hatch their own chicks, so they're sourcing from the industrial hatcheries. Separation of families. they have to take the baby calves away from the the mother cows in the dairy industry. That doesn't change, no matter the label. If it's organic or certified humane, it doesn't matter. They still take the babies from the mothers, which causes so much psychological trauma to both the cow and the calf, being separated like that. What does a calf, what does a calf want? They're scared, they don't understand, they're frightened, they want the love and comfort of their mother. And that's completely denied in all dairy. So there's these inherent cruelties. There's the confinement doesn't really change. The mutilation of their bodies and painful mutilations without anesthesia, that doesn't change. There's the slaughter at a very young age. They still go to slaughter in just a fraction of their lifespan. So all these things that are the reasons that we're vegan, the reasons that we're calling out animal agriculture, those things don't change. The changes are very minimal. And so I'll talk about cage free. Let's talk about cage free eggs. This is something that we see a lot of now. I mean, they're actually predicting that cage free eggs will be about 75% of the market in 15 years. So that the industry is moving towards that. Battery cages are horrible, absolutely. And the battery cage system is the typical system that is used for egg laying hens. And that's where they're trying to get as many hens in a building as possible by cramming them into cages, stacking them up, rows and rows and rows, tens of thousands of birds in one building. And of course, it is horrible. It's like would be like living your whole life in a crowded elevator. You know how awful it is to be in a crowded elevator and you're like touching other people and you just can't wait to get to the floor where you can get off. Well, imagine that being your entire life. You can't get off at the next level. That's it. That's all the space you're given, and that's a battery cage hen. So, absolutely, it's horrible. But what the industry has done and what the solution is with cage free is basically they just have taken out the cages of these big windowless warehouses, and they are just packed in totally crammed in there on the floor. They call it a floor system, living in their own waste. It's burning their sensitive nose and eyes and throat. They're living in monotony and misery, unable to get any sunlight, no sunbathing, no dust bathing. These are natural, wonderful things that hens love to do. They're miserable in there, and that is labeled cage free. And now suddenly all of the issues are kind of funneled into this one issue, their confinement. And so the industry shifts and says, okay, well, we'll get them out of the cages. Since you're so upset about the cages, we'll get them out of the cages. Now everything's okay. No, it's not okay. That we can't funnel all the problems into one issue, the cage, and think that we're going to be fine without the cages. There's so many inherent cruelties in the whole industry. So that's just one example. There's lots of others. But basically, bottom line, and I encourage people to read the book if they'd like to. It's called The Ultimate Betrayal: Is There Happy Meat? And I go into great detail about each of the labels, what they mean, and how very little regulation. I mean, that's another part of it, is that these labels are so unregulated. I mean, they're minimally defined and zero regulated, zero regulation. The definitions are so loose, and basically it's just the farmer's own, account. There's no on-site inspection. There's no, they don't really have to do anything other than fill out a form, send it to the USDA or the FDA. Now, I'm talking about all of this, of course, I'm talking about is the US, and I'm just now remembering and realizing that I am talking to a UK audience. So things may be a little different in the UK, though I don't think much. You guys are often about 3 steps ahead of us in animal welfare issues. You always are a bit better. and then we can use you as a precedent to get even better. But I think in general, these industry standards that I'm talking about are pretty universal to both the US and the UK. But
Yeah.
anyway, yeah. So basically, I go into detail of the ethics and the labels, as well as the environmental impact. I have an entire section on the environmental impact. So I encourage you to read the book if you want to.
Yeah, well, thank you. I actually wanted to touch on kind of, you talked about like people buying, like resorting to labels like cage free or I think like sustainable as well and things like that. So, how does that what does that do for kind of like the psychology of like people, and even in terms of like the environment, of course, like, so it has like the animal welfare impact, has the environmental impact. Like what is it kind of still doing to hurt the environment, and what and kind of how does that like desensitize people to actually what they might still be contributing to in terms of the environment and animals?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I saw it pop up that Australia is here too. Hi, Australia. That's awesome. uh, so that's really interesting, the psychology of it all, because when someone is buying these labels, there's kind of two things that can happen. One, a lot of people, it makes them look into it more, and so they can discover for themselves the humane hoax, and a lot of people that buy these labels end up going vegan. However, there's a whole nother segment that when they're buying these labels, it is a complacency, and it makes them feel like, oh, I'm doing something, I'm doing a little better, I'm okay now, I'm buying my free range eggs. So it's definitely something we need to be aware of. We need to incorporate into our activism and incorporate into our dialogue and our messaging, because people really do feel, they feel complacent in that they're doing the right thing by buying these labels, buying into these labels. So, but the environmental aspect is really important too, and there's certainly a part of the humane hoax is really greenwashing. The labels like sustainable and organic and even free range. People think that that's somehow better environmentally, and it's certainly not. All these labels, again, that I could break it down and show how each of these are not anywhere near better, but in some cases they're even worse. Grass-fed beef, actually, it's coming out now in studies that grass-fed beef is actually creating more greenhouse gases than their grain-eating cousins, and they use more water as well and more land. So it's actually can be worse for the environment, and it's so just ironic, because that is why people are buying these labels. They think it's more environmental. And actually, I just interviewed on my podcast. I started a podcast in the pandemic age when all my events got canceled. So I started a podcast, and it's called Hope for the Animals podcast, if anybody wants to check it out. But I just interviewed Dr. Sailesh Rao, who works with an organization that he founded called Climate Healers. And he recently called out the one of the people, I'm not sure, I can't remember her name now, but someone in Extinction Rebellion, your sister organization, that they were promoting, unfortunately, sustainable and you know, uh, rotational grazing, holistic management grazing. There's a lot of different names for the new grass-fed beef, and it's really unfortunate, because it can be even worse than a CAFOS, because numerous reasons. First of all, you've got to have numerous acres of land for a very small amount of animals. So if you're moving them from pasture to pasture, this rotational grazing, where supposedly it's not as impactful on the land, then you've got to have numerous acres. And so, what's going to happen? Are farmers going to have to just clear that land? You fill in the wetlands, cut down the trees to be able to accommodate the space for all this rotational grazing, plus all the fencing that goes in is disruptive to wildlife migration. There's numerous issues with rotational grazing or holistic management grazing, all these terms for new ways of doing grass-fed beef. And ultimately, if you look at the science, it just doesn't hold water. The science, there's been numerous studies done over the last few decades on this form of grazing animals. There's been studies done in numerous different areas, different precipitation zones, all kinds of different ways that they have studied it. And ultimately, the majority of the studies have said, the majority of the science says, it's no better. It's no better, and it can actually be worse. So ultimately, if we really want to, curb climate change immediately, and we need to do this fast, no, we can't find some other way of doing the wrong thing. No, transitioning to a vegan world is really what's going to bring about the quick climate change action that we need.
Yeah, thank you. Which is, yeah, exactly what we're trying to strive for, a plant-based system. And yeah, I think it will definitely happen with all of this energy. I did also just wanted to ask, you mentioned like your podcast, which um, actually I feel like lots of people, like including myself, it gets a little bit difficult, like during this lockdown period, feeling a bit like helpless sometimes, or feeling like you're not able to like actively like do something. And obviously it's been quite a long time, so that can often get people quite down. But like what are kind of maybe the ways that you've been remaining active during this time, so that you are still promoting like the end of animal agriculture and like a transition towards a plant-based food system? And like, yeah, what would you maybe have for like others as well? What could they do during this time?
Yeah. Well, it was yeah, it was really, really rough for me, at least, because spring is my biggest time for events. I mean, spring and summer, when spring and summer hit, I am doing events weekly, whether it's that I'm going to a veg fest to speak, or I'm organizing veg fest. I organize the Sonoma County Veg Fest. I also organize Berkeley Earth Day. I organize the Conscious Eating Conference, and then amongst all that, I'm speaking at numerous places and flying to different parts of the country to speak. And that all just like went whew, shut down. It was bizarre. It's been a very bizarre spring. It's like the first spring in 30 years that I'm not out in the community doing events and activism. So it was hard for me at first. Honestly, I had a hard time figuring out what to do, what the heck to do. And I talked a lot with United Poultry Concerns, my the group that I work with, and also Compassionate Living, my local group. And we I decided to do a podcast for numerous reasons. I'm not very technically like good. I'm kind of technically challenged, I'm in my 50s. So that's, it's harder for me. It doesn't come easy for me. However, I felt that I'm a good speaker, a good host. I thought, well, maybe I can do this podcast thing. And I love podcasts. I personally love podcasts because we're always staring at a screen. Everything else, almost every other form of activism that I had to choose from, uh, with the lockdown, with the internet, is staring at a screen. You're either reading an article, watching a webinar, watching a video, whatever it is. podcast is the only time that I can put in my headphones and go take a walk or go out and garden for a bit. Or, I really like that. I like that break from the screen. So I'm really into podcasts. So I thought, well, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to figure it out. And thank God for YouTube tutorials, because I taught myself basically how to audio edit and all of that. I'm getting guests, and I have a few episodes now. Hopefortheanimals.org, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org, and I'm trying to get that going. And it's really awesome because you can edit out all the ums and and I can all sound great. I love it. So yeah, so really into the podcast. It's tough. I mean, I worry about the months of inaction as far as face to face and being out in the community. And I think about all those leaflets that are sitting in the garages right now, that are not getting distributed and all of that. And but at the same time, we have to do something. We have to figure it out. The animals, the slaughter hasn't stopped. The suffering hasn't ended. We have to figure out something to do. And so I got over my fear and I just went for it. And I encourage everyone to do whatever we can, get creative, figure it out. We've got to continue the message.
Yeah, thank you. Well, hopefully that is like maybe inspiring for other people who might be thinking to make podcasts or having conversations with people, or just wasn't sure if you weren't sure what to do. But yeah, I feel like I've asked you loads of questions, so I'm going to hand it over to Daniel.
Hi, up. Yeah, it's interesting just to hear about obviously, how you're doing things currently during lockdown and the situation that we're in. But in terms of long term at least, with the rise of different zoonotics and pandemics, how do you think, because obviously there's been different activist groups that have been focusing on different theories of change over the past 40 or 50 years. And now it's kind of like, well, we're sort of at a brick wall because, the facilities and tools that we had at the moment aren't currently available. And it's kind of like, how do we adapt that now, knowing that, in the long term, this is going to be happening more and more frequently, and how we can, get creative with it, but create like a more long-term system to try and achieve change. And do you think that it's going to be more difficult or easier with, more online tools?
This is not my expertise, honestly. I'm not sure. I'm not very technical. But that's the way the world is going. So, I like you said, I mean, who knows what the future holds, if there's going to be the opportunities that we had going out into the world and being able to interact with people. Yeah. I mean, I think we do need to shift a lot to being online and to figuring out how to do things differently. But honestly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this question, if you don't mind, because it's not my expertise and I don't really know what would be the best thing to do. I think that others need to analyze that and study it. Yeah.
Cool. And just you mentioned about the United Poultry Concerns. Now, obviously, with a lot of the when the climate movement does mention anything to do with agriculture, there's this big focus on beef, and there's this big focus on much larger animals, let's say. And I'm sort of going to ask you, I guess, is that obviously the United Poultry Concern focuses on chickens and turkeys. So what is your I suppose your motivation behind that?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So United Poultry Concerns decided to focus on chickens and turkeys back in the 90s. And, when Karen started the organization, she had people telling her, we can't get people to care about whales. How on earth are you going to get people to care about chickens? And her response to that was, well, even more reason to start an organization for chickens then. And I'm so glad she did. And it's still going strong 30 years later. So so there's twofold things. You were asking about the environmental impact, and I'll start with that, and then I'll get into why I think it's ethically important to focus on chickens. But environmentally, it's very frustrating, because if you hear anything from environmentalists about animal products, which is rare, it's getting much better now, and I hear it so much more now, and I'm so grateful. Time Magazine had this spread just the other day about, you know, what you can do, and reducing and eliminating meat was like right there, and I was like, yes, all right, we've come so far. So that's great, but it's not enough, and unfortunately, when they break it down and you do hear about what kinds of animal products to avoid, you're right, often it's beef. Beef gets the worst rap. Beef, it's terrible. You know, switch to white meat, right? And the unfortunate thing about this is that when you're comparing different animal products, so, you know, beef may be up here, but, you know, there's other, chicken may be here when you're talking about in terms of climate change, but water use, chicken meat and egg production actually uses more water, incredibly much more water than beef. So it's not all necessarily about climate change. There are lots of environmental impacts. And then, so you're up here with, you know, comparing beef and chicken and comparing beef and pork and stuff. And then, well, okay, let's throw in plant foods. Let's talk about comparing to plant foods. Oh, we're way down here. Okay, the impact is so much lower. The impact is incredibly much lower. So, you know, what we need to be doing is not just shifting a little, you know, to something that's slightly better, maybe. No, we need to, you know, reduce our impact substantially and take it down to vegan, down to a plant-based diet. And also another issue with chicken that is a real problem is the pollution of waterways and our groundwater. So what happens is in chicken farming in the barns, they use, this is for chickens that are bred for meat, as well as the parent flocks that are creating the fertilized eggs for the hatcheries. They use this sawdust, you know, sawdust and wood shavings. Litter is what it's called, this litter on the floor. And so there's this, you know, acres and acres and acres of litter, and it gets built up with, you know, waste and gunk and dead animals and all kinds of things. And they just scoop this litter up and dump it on the farm somewhere. And it pollutes the groundwater, goes into our waterways. I mean, this is why there is so much pollution around chicken farming in Virginia and other places from the litter waste. And dead animals, you know, just they'll, you know, we've been talking now about the culling and depopulating and euthanizing, these very sterilized terms for basically killing, you know, tens of thousands of birds in one shot for the pandemic. Well, that happens all the time. That happens all the time. They have to, you know, to kill all these birds at once, and a lot of them just get dumped on the farm, and that waste goes into the groundwater. So my point is, there are so many different impacts for in animal agriculture: water waste, water pollution, air pollution, and climate change. So you have to look at that whole package, and chicken farming is incredibly destructive on the environment. So just going from beef to chicken, you're not doing any favors to the environment or to your carbon footprint. So so that's the environmental part. But the ethical part as well, you know, when you hear people say, oh, I'm cutting back on meat, like we just said, they're often cutting back on beef, but they're switching that meat to pork or chicken and often chicken. In fact, chicken is the one meat that's kind of going up. This is in US statistics. Beef and pork are going way down, but chicken meat is kind of getting more popular. And the problem there, well, of course, there's a lot of problems there, but one is that chickens' bodies, their little bodies are so much smaller, so that you have to kill so many more souls to feed the same number of people. For every one pig that's killed, 60 chickens are killed. For every one cow that's killed, 100 and something like 120 chickens-ish are killed. So many more little souls. So it was people that even think, well, oh, I want to be more ethical. I want to do better. So I'll switch to chicken. You're killing more animals by switching to chicken. And then when you poll people about their feelings for animals in general, like what animals they feel are more intelligent, what animals they feel have more emotional capacity, those kinds of things. When polled, they will say dogs and cats. Oh, dogs and cats have the most emotions, emotional capacity, have the most intelligence, right? Well, we know these animals. That's why. They've been in our lives. We know these animals. We know that they can suffer. We know that they can be joyful. So we think that they are the most intelligent. Cows and pigs come somewhere next. Chickens are always underneath that, thinking that they have less capacity for emotion, are less intelligent, and they're only higher than fish on this kind of, level and scale of what people consider intelligence and emotional capacity. So there's, I think, something in people that they think, well, chickens don't suffer as much. Chickens, they don't know what's going on. This is all so false, so untrue. Chickens are amazing creatures. And what we've learned scientifically about the avian brain just in the last couple decades has been amazing. I mean, they are depthful in their intelligence, in their emotional capacity. They form friendships. They can be deceiving. There's a lot going on in these beautiful animals, and to think that well, they don't know what's happening to them. It's so not true. And you know it when you go to a sanctuary and these chickens get rescued from these horrible places, and then they come to a sanctuary. Suddenly they just come to life. They their little personalities come out, and some of them are just joyful and want to be with people. Some of them are more, they're individuals. And we really need to focus on them, because they're 97% of the animals that are killed for meat, dairy, and eggs. When we say meat, dairy, and eggs, well, 97% of that is chicken meat and egg production. So we have to focus on the chickens. They need our voices. They need our help. They need us to tell their stories and to talk about them as much as we can.
Awesome, thank you, Hope. And I suppose on that note, like in terms of for a long time, it seems that we can just never find a good way to translate the science to something that the public can actually digest. And it can be quite difficult to find a balance of providing the facts, but also doing it in a positive way that people welcome. So like, yeah, I suppose maybe it's not something that you can answer, but like, yeah, I suppose maybe that's where things have been failing, is like the communication of the science and that actually translating into policy and legislation. So how do you think, in terms of the scientific evidence that we've got, that can be communicated in a more like digestible way for people?
Always the question. And academics get really frustrated with this. I know my husband is an academic, and he gets into it thinking he's going to change the world, and then nobody listens to the to the papers. But so I would say that science is important, and I think that we do want to talk about the studies. But what's even more important are stories and the animals themselves. stories of the animals themselves, working with sanctuaries to get those stories. You know, there's kind of a debate. I don't know if there is same in the UK, but there's certainly a debate in the US because there has been such a flux or there's so many sanctuaries now popping up, lots of sanctuaries, micro sanctuaries, and lots of sanctuaries that are rescuing animals. And the frustration is that, you know, well, you can only rescue so many. Why don't you put that energy into vegan education? You know, and I get that. I understand that argument. However, if it's someone's passion to do this farm sanctuary and that's what they're going to do, and they probably wouldn't be able to do vegan outreach, then let them do it. But get the stories. I mean, this is where we can meet the animals, where we can know the animals, where we can get these personal stories of rescue and rehabilitation and personalities and all of that. So at UPC, we have a sanctuary for birds. There's over 150 resident birds that we've rescued. So we have their stories. I think it's really important to individualize, personalize the animals. When you're talking about stats and studies, and it's important too. I don't mean to not talk about studies. I do it all the time because it's fascinating to me. But if you only have a certain amount of time or a certain amount of space to really get a message across, I would focus in on individual animals and their stories. I think that is what's going to touch people's hearts, because it has been proven again and again and again, not only with veganism or you know, our realm, but with marketing. And with marketing, with other larger environmental I'm sorry, NGOs and nonprofits, when they go in and do, you know, focus groups and studies, and we've learned again and again and again that it's not science and numbers that get people to make change and make personal change. It's emotion. They have to be touched. They have to feel it. So we've got to get them to feel the animals' suffering and to feel their stories and to feel their joy at liberation and when they go to a sanctuary. So it's really important to tell animal stories, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you, Hope. And yeah, I suppose just some feedback from myself from that is absolutely. I think that you know, if people can relate to a story, no matter how simplistic, it's like that's what gets people engaged, and people have been engaged in stories since the beginning of time. So, and that's how we've learned. So we're going to open the floor up to some questions in the chat from people who have asked some things. So we have Dennis, and then we have Charlie, and then we have Sarah. So would you each like to ask your questions? Start with Dennis.
Hello, could you hear me?
All good.
Yeah, I can.
So whenever I try to open and discuss the